Hi, welcome to chapter 22. We're talking in this chapter about progressivism. I want to start off by mentioning to you to pay attention to some of the details on this slide. I won't go over them individually, but it's just kind of a chronology of things that happened during the time period we're talking about during the progressive era. We see in 1874, we start there with the Women's Christian Temperance Union established, and then this chapter ends with President Wilson being in office in 1916. So we cover a good span of time in this chapter. Just take a moment to look over this, and you might want to pause the slide to go back to it. I would expect that some of this information would be on your test. Hint, hint. Progressivism came about because of this fear of bigness. You know, we started our nation with this fear of the bigness of our mother country, England, being able to tax us at their will and that sort of thing. So we still have this fear of bigness. And at this point, during our founding fathers had a fear of bigness of government. Some of them didn't want a big, strong federal or central government. Now we see this fear of bigness in the way of business, because when a business was too big, it would have lots of wealth and power. And when the elite are in power, it's like it creates this feeling of being at the mercy of this private power. And the Americans at this time were not looking forward to something like that. And so that's how this progressive movement started. And you know the meaning of the word progress, which is moving forward. So the progressive movement wanted to move forward. There's another reason for this whole idea of uncertainties, and it ties back into that fear of bigness. With the railroads growing, shipping got cheaper, which was great, but it started then turning what had been a local market into something more regional. And then as the railroads were international, it created national markets. So business was more competitive and prices dropped, which was good, except it was affecting local businesses at this point. Monopolies of these bigger businesses undercut prices to force others out of business. Then, when they were the only ones remaining, they increased prices. In terms of uncertainties, we're still talking about the growth of trust. A merger is when a combination of multiple companies join to make one. Sometimes it's just two companies, sometimes it might be three or more, but a merger is when multiple companies join together or combine to make one. From 1892 to 1902, 2,500 companies merged in the United States to form large trusts. In 1901, the first billion-dollar corporation was formed called U.S. Steel. Trust at this point seemed to be everywhere. Monopolies were in banking and railroads and farm machinery. And remember, we're still largely agricultural here. Iron and steel, sugar refining, petroleum, meat packing, tobacco, etc. So as industries are developing, we also see these trusts developing more and more. So we're seeing big business start to develop. And consumers, the general public, was very wary of this kind of big business. Another uncertainty was the high cost of living in the city. And a lot of young people were moving to the city, staying out of farming altogether, because there was really nothing for them in the country. They wanted the opportunities from the city. And people began to feel like, these new urban consumers began to feel like they were at the mercy of distributors and producers, because the cities really didn't have the agriculture needed to keep up with family needs. And during this time, too, middle-class laborers who actually worked in factories to produce goods didn't see themselves as producers. They saw themselves as consumers. And I think the way to explain that best is that they didn't see themselves as producers because they weren't the business owners. They were the people who worked for the business. And in that way, as a laborer, they really were the consumer more than the producer. Until 1900, most families were still self-sufficient. They farmed, they had home remedies for illnesses, and they used their livestock for their meat supply. But now, during this progressive era, we have meat packing and shipping available, and we have businesses developing that are trying to sell medical remedies and that sort of thing. So now this food is supplied by corporations, so it causes some problems. There are problems with unsanitary butchers, and sometimes they doctored meat to make it look fresher than it really was. There were problems with strikes and boycotting. So, if you didn't appreciate one business's practices, you could boycott it, or just simply boycotting means not patronize that business. But striking was also a problem. So if you need a product and those employees are on strike, you couldn't get the product. So that was an issue that was faced during the progressive era. Another thing, as business grew, suddenly there were no accounts for charging at local stores or local bartering. With these bigger companies, they were not interested in setting up a charge account you could pay off after your harvest or something like that. They wanted their money on the front end. And also, before 1900, when families were self-sufficient, they would use lamps, candle lamps for light in their homes, and they use wood for heat. And so now we've got public utilities, which is a great advancement. However, the public now relies on these utilities. And so this dependence on people also created an opportunity for deception to develop. So the dependence on meat suppliers and the dependence on big companies, the dependence on public utilities meant that because of that demand for those services, then the people, if they were corrupt, could create deceptions that would affect the consumers negatively. There were also some uncertainties for farmers, African Americans, and women during the progressive era. Farmers were still profiting, but they had problems with railroad shipments, farm equipment credit, and, like I mentioned before, fewer young people were staying on farms. They chose to move to the city, so that's a problem for agriculture. Women at this point are starting to get an education, even a college education, but there were no career opportunities for those women once they completed their educations. So in most states, even at this time, women still couldn't vote or hold office. And in terms of African Americans, the South was segregated. The situation was better in the North, but even there, African Americans still dealt with discrimination in terms of college and career. And this slide just shows a few pictures of some important people during this era. We'll start at the left. Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, who were suffragists from the early 19th century. And suffragists, I want to make sure we're clear on this word, because suffrage and suffer sound so much alike, these things get kind of confused. So the suffragist movement was the attempt to get people, or to get women, the right to vote. So women's suffrage is the right to vote for women. So suffrage means right to vote or voting ability. Not to be confused with suffer. Women suffered because they couldn't vote, but the suffrage movement was a good thing. So women's suffrage is good, suffer is bad. So just try to keep those words separate in your mind. Also, in the center, we have Alice Paul, who was founder of a little newspaper called the Suffragist newspaper. Another term that you will see if you do much reading about the suffrage movement is that there are two terms that are used a little interchangeably, and they shouldn't be: suffragist and suffragette. So a suffragist is anyone, male or female, who supported the women's suffrage movement. Anyone, male or female, who thought that women should have the right to vote. Suffragette were women who sought the right to vote for women. So suffragette, like Smurfette was a girl, so suffragette were women who supported the right to vote for women. But suffragist included men too. And then in the right corner, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, the first publicity director and newsletter editor for the NAACP. He was very instrumental in setting that first perception and image for the NAACP as they began their focus on civil rights. Opinion makers during the Progressive era came about through journalism, print journalism at this time, and we have something called the muckrakers. It sounds like a bad thing, but muckrakers could actually serve a purpose. Editors and journalists and essayists who uncover dirt or corruption are called muckrakers. And they began this progressive style of news reporting, of being proactive to serve kind of as a government watchdog. So they were looking for corruption to report it to the public because an informed public can make an informed vote at election time. Progressivism then enters into the political arena. City government began to believe that cities should be run like big businesses. And the National Municipal Reform League, which was formed in 1894, began overthrowing corrupt governments and replacing that corruption with progressive politicians. So then you have people serving in city offices who want progress. Social progressives improve the lives of the poor and examine the slums to consider the effects on human behavior. This social progressiveness was supported by ministers, priests, rabbis, basically all religions, because it addressed moral consciousness. It addressed the need to look after each other and to provide care for our neighbors. So in the states, we also see progressivism developing in each individual state. Reformers turned to their legislators at the state level to make these changes. Robert La Follette was a governor and a progressive in lawmaking. He took on corrupt railroad businesses through government. Southern progressivism, the southern states were attacking the policies of railroads, utility companies, and insurance providers. And then in terms of Black Americans, they had to deal with some things because Southern progressivism still was for white people only. Still had this very separate but equal mentality, although the words "but equal" should really be in quotes because there was nothing equal about it. The Southern Black Americans had to deal with the Jim Crow laws. And you hear about this all the time and you think, what was Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow was actually a character played by a white entertainer who wore blackface and performed as a bumbling fool. So, Jim Crow, not an actual person, he was a fictional character. And he was a goofy fictional character. So the fact that referred to these as Jim Crow laws just is very offensive to African Americans in general. In terms of women progressiveness, women worked very diligently for social reform, not just women, but men worked on behalf of women too. But in terms of women working on different issues, one of the first issues that they tackled, in addition to wanting the right to vote, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the temperance basically means prohibition. These people wanted prohibition. They wanted to ban alcoholic beverages. And nationally, that actually happened in the United States from 1920 to 1933. So we know that Hot Spring County is in a dry county. Imagine that nationwide. Except, we'll get to that a little bit in a minute. I'll save it. So anyway, a dry nation from 1920 to 1933. And in 1890, and we talked about merging. Well, we have two organizations that merge in 1890. The National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association, which were rival organizations, merged to create the larger National American Woman Suffrage Association. You know, there's a saying, united we stand, divided we fall. So these two rival organizations merged to create a much stronger organization in the movement for the right to vote for women. Progressivism goes national with the election of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a nationalist. It's important to know this up front. He identified the United States with virtue, which is not a bad thing. You know, he felt like the U.S. was virtuous. But he saw that non-Anglo-Saxon countries and races were inferior, in his opinion. So while Theodore Roosevelt said that, you know, the United States had virtue and was the best, you know, we know our definition of nationalism includes a love of one's nation, the best nation of all. Roosevelt actually, you know, applies that term for nationalism. But it's important to remember that when he's looking at our country, he's not patriotic in that way. Nationalism means that he feels like a group of people is inferior or that his particular group of people is superior. So we don't see him leading the a real progressive stance on civil rights at this point as far as African Americans are concerned. But Theodore Roosevelt is progressive in some other areas. So, for instance, the Newlands Act in 1902 set aside money from the sale of federal lands to build dams and canals in the really dry western part of the United States. And building those waterways would also help with conservation issues. And he also established the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903, which gave power to subpoena industries in antitrust lawsuits. So he's taking on big business in that, taking on big business and addressing conservation and irrigation issues for the West, but still not seeing the bigger picture as far as civil rights go, race-wise. Theodore Roosevelt had this, what became known as the Square Deal, which basically just established the federal government as having a role in disputes between capital and labor that vitally affected consumers. And we still see today sometimes the president will step in and declare a strike to end or something like that. So this is where that started. And this new nationalism that comes about, the Hepburn Act came about in Roosevelt's second term in 1906. It gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to set rates for private business. The ICC then could audit interstate railroads. It outlawed free passes that were used to bribe politicians. So railroads who, you know, were really lobbying for favorable legislation would offer free travel to politicians, and the Interstate Commerce Commission through the Hepburn Act outlawed that. So this was a victory for reformers because they were seeing some difference in corrupt government and business practices. But it was not a victory for the railroads, obviously, who now lose that leg of their lobbying power. Roosevelt's administration also passed some food and drug legislation that would protect consumers. First was the Meat Inspection Act, which was actually brought to the public attention by Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was a book about the filth of Chicago's meatpacking industry. And then conservation, progressives favored policies to protect natural resources. And the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 set aside federal lands that could be used for wildlife reserves, or it gave the government the ability to do that. So any federal lands, the government could select to set aside a part of it in order to focus on conservation of wildlife and natural resources. Things were going pretty well during the Progressive era, and specifically during this time frame, but there was a panic in 1907. The United States was on the brink of bankruptcy, or I'm sorry, the brink of depression, and J.P. Morgan and other individual bankers loaned money to banks to save the day. President Taft was president at this time. He ran as a progressive, but his legislature or his legislation was conservative. So that creates a conflict. And then the Republicans split their loyalties. With Taft's progressivism wasn't the same that Roosevelt's had been, and so people start splitting loyalties. And this is an editorial cartoon from the Progressive era. You can see the president, Theodore Roosevelt, who is dressed as a king there, carries his successor, William Howard Taft, on his shoulder. So Roosevelt's progressive policies ushered in the White House bid for Taft, who said he was also progressive. However, he was really a true conservative at heart. So this just basically shows that by saying he was a progressive like Roosevelt, he let Roosevelt's popularity and progressivism carry him into the White House. And also note that Taft is pictured as a baby and Roosevelt is dressed as a king who simply lets Taft wear his crown. So this paints Taft as immature and like a little kid who might say anything to get his way, in this case, to get the vote. In the election of 1912, Wilson won the Electoral College vote. Wilson was the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, Democrat. And Theodore Roosevelt won the popular vote. He was the Republican candidate, but this time he was a little more radical. And it was a little less than his reserved self from the past, but this radicalism, the voters loved it. And also Eugene Debs ran, and he was the Socialist Party candidate. So he kind of split the vote between the opposition there. And this map shows how the states voted in the election of 1912. And you can see the Electoral College votes are posted as well. So during Wilson's administration, we see this new freedom in action. Woodrow Wilson was a strong president, and under the 1913 Underwood Tariff Act, he lowered the tariffs and started charging the federal income tax. Now, it may not seem very popular today, but by lowering those tariffs, imports could be sold cheaper, and it impacted the consumer's ability to buy. He also created the Federal Reserve Act, which created a central bank to supply money and credit to the nation. And in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission replaced Teddy Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations. This was the public's watchdog against trust. So there were some problems during Wilson's administration. First of all, he declined to support women's suffrage. So obviously he does not have the support of women who at this point are still decent lobbyists even though they can't vote. So that's an issue for him. He also chose to bargain with big corporations, whereas others in the progressive era didn't want to bargain with big corporations. They wanted to shut them down or they wanted to keep them in line. And he also imposed Jim Crow laws in federal government. And I'd like you to strike out that "remember he was a nationalist" section there, just to remove it, because that's actually Theodore Roosevelt that we were talking about. So just remove that part and just know that the Wilson administration imposed Jim Crow laws in federal government. So in conclusion, urban Americans, the people in the cities during this time period, developed a progressive outlook. Progressivism was more sophisticated than populism. So with populism, That was the idea that an ordinary person could feel like someone cared about them, that the ordinary person had a voice. Progressivism was more than that. It was more than just, hey, everyone who's the most average person has a voice. It was more like the average person can advance through government. So progressivism was more proactive. But progressives, it's important to note, still were not free of prejudice at this time. So prejudice, racism, uh, discrimination, all those things are still in play very much during the progressive era.